Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Michael. Michael is a research fellow in the Medieval and Early Modern Studies program at the Institute for Religion and Critical Inquiry. And I'm the director of that program. And I am very pleased to welcome you also on behalf of Peter Howard, the director of the Institute for Religion and Critical Inquiry at the Australian Catholic University. And Peter, you might want to just wave your hand and people will know that is Peter Howard. And we, you know, in the MEMS program, where our interest in the Middle Ages and the early modern period does focus on religion, but it's religion as an element of culture, and our view of the early modern period is actually very broad and extends really all the way, at least to the 19th century, in many ways past the present moment. And so when Andrew Mackenzie-McHarg, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute, suggested Sophia Rosenfeld as a seminar leader, I was really thrilled. Andrew came to us from fellowships at Cornell and at the Warburg and Cambridge, did his doctorate and also research in Germany, is a specialist in conspiracy theory, and he's going to be moderating this session. And with no further delay, I hand it over to you, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for everyone for who's participating in today's seminar. I know that participation under these circumstances means that we can do that from the comfort of our homes, at least for many of us. But of course, we're also participating across multiple time zones and being kind of slight disruptions to our normal schedules. I've noticed my tendency, my rhythm has become more and more bohemian during this lockdown, but I can still manage 10 a.m. Some of us are tuning in outside of normal working hours, and that applies most of all to our speaker, who is joining us from Philadelphia. I think it's just turned 8 o'clock in the evening there, but we're very proud and happy to have enlisted Professor Sophia Rosenfeld for this event. Professor Sophia Rosenfeld is the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm very grateful to a colleague of mine, Tanya Feiler, for some years ago urging me to read Sophie's book, Common Sense, A Political History. For upon opening the book, it soon became clear not only how the book overlapped with some of the interests that Tanya and I shared, but also simply how rich the vein of intellectual history was into which Sophie had tapped with this inquiry. Common sense stakes a claim to apply to many aspects of our shared experience, but it also has the pretense of applying to itself. Common sense informs us what common sense is. As such, the concept wards off inquiry with a somewhat disingenuous gesture. Nothing to see here, folks, move on now. And in her 2011 book, Sophie refused to obey that injunction, and instead, by excavating the history of common sense and uncovering the linkages with fundamental issues about democratic rule and populist protest, she demonstrated the potential of intellectual history both to illuminate the past and speak to the present. And her most recent book, Democracy, there's a copy of it just there, Democracy and Truth, A Short History, illustrates once more her mastery in combining these two tasks in her historical research. Now, when Sophie visited the UK to deliver a lecture and hold a seminar on the history of common sense, she gave us a tantalizing glimpse of an ongoing project, an aspect of which she will address in her talk today, titled Making Choices in the Early Modern World. And as such, we will be privileged with a sneak preview of her next book, a work whose subject matter makes me confident in predicting that it too will exhibit those qualities that makes her research stand out. And allow me simply to mention one of those qualities. If critics of neoliberalism inform us that trickle-down economics does not work, Sophie's research exposes the inadequacies of trickle-down intellectual history. Instead of imagining intellectual history as a story of great thinkers thinking great thoughts and then imparting these great thoughts to a grateful society, her work, when it does invoke these individuals, contextualizes their ideas by drawing upon the neighboring fields of social, political, and cultural history. Perhaps, however, the trickle-down model retains some validity when it comes to colleagues, though one might prefer here to speak not so much of percolation, but more of pollination in describing how we gratefully receive and take on their ideas, innovations, and suggestions. This seems true to me, not only for the way in which my own research endeavors have been enriched by Sophie's work, but also by Jonathan's, who has been kind enough to provide comments to today's talk. Professor Jonathan Sheehan is a professor of history at Berkeley and was for many years a director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. Over these last years, I've kept his works within easy reach, in particular his book, The Enlightenment Bible, Translation, Scholarship, Culture from 2005, and then Invisible Hands, Self-Organization and the 18th Century from 2015, which he co-authored with Dror Varman. More than he presumably realizes, these works have been my trusty companions when undertaking my own more modest efforts to excavate episodes in the long story of how Western society divested itself of its religious foundations and slowly, painfully, fitfully reconciled itself with a secular lack of foundations. So at the outset, thanks to Sophie and Jonathan for their willingness to support our attempts to keep academic discussion alive and kicking under conditions of isolation and lockdown. These days, we hear a lot about the distinction between essential and non-essential work, and I guess we would admit that our work as historians falls under the latter category. It is not as if society grinds to a halt when historians stop doing their work. But if one were to make the case that what we do actually is essential, one could point both to Sophie's and Jonathan's work, because it demonstrates how societies that have become secular and democratic are placed under a peculiar burden to reflect upon this state, to reconstruct how it emerged, and to appreciate both the opportunities and frustrations that it entails. So, to use an outmoded expression, Sophie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And let me thank Andrew Mackenzie-McCarg again, and also Chris Auker and Jonathan Sheehan for so kindly offering to respond. Peter Howard, really everybody who made this possible, this what I would call really an unusual event that may become more usual as time goes by. And let me also thank all of you. I see there are 38 participants to be listed here. That's a lot of people to tune in to a Zoom conversation, and I'm grateful to all of you for being here. So let me get started, and I think I'm going to approach this, I hope you'll bear with me, by using a more conversational mode and not do this as a kind of formal talk. I'm just going to talk and not for that long. And you know, if you want to interrupt and say something, please go ahead. If you want to wait and ask a question afterwards, that's fine too. But what I'll do is tell you a little bit about the project that Andrew just mentioned, and I'll be most interested to hear your thoughts, particularly on the parts that do take us back to the early modern world. But let me begin with the present, and I hope I know I'm talking to medievalists and early modernists, and I hope you'll indulge me a bit by letting me say something that's both a little bit obvious and very presentist, just as an opening. And that's this. It seems obvious to me, at least, that we're asked to make choices, and we talk about choice an awful lot in the modern world, and I really mean around the world these days. If you drive down a highway, you'll see billboards for making good choices and smart choices. You go into a supermarket, you have to make a choice what kind of what kind of mustard you want to buy, what kind of sneakers. That kind of commercial choice is everywhere. But that's not the only place we really encounter choice. Human rights, democratic culture is also infused with notions of choice at the moment. Starting as early as the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, already there's talk of rights being the right to choose various things, to choose a religion, to choose a place to live, to choose a profession. This is language that's not eternal, but emerges in the 40s. It's in every constitution since then. All over the world, different kinds of rights to choose accorded to different kinds of people. And it tends to be, this is the kind of thing that interests me, one of those words that crosses the sort of right-left divide in politics. People might be for different kinds of choice, but they tend to be for choice in general. Even as we fight about it, in other words, it's almost something that nobody says they're opposed to. Nobody says I'm really anti-choice, whatever that comes up. And even our explanatory models these days tend to have an emphasis on choice. It can be celebratory and it can be punitive, but the sense that one has a responsibility for choices made. My point is really this, that choice has become one of those things that seems central to how we define ourselves. And in this process of making choices, we've come to take choice as something almost synonymous to freedom. So in many ways, what I'm interested in doing is writing a history of modern freedom. Anybody who's been following the news in the last week or two has noticed that sometimes choice has even emerged in the context of all of our lockdowns. So, for instance, all the protesters in the United States who've been showing up at state houses claiming that their freedom is being infringed have often oddly appropriated slogans like "my body, my choice," which is generally a pro-choice reproductive freedom position, but used it to say my choice whether I wear a face mask, my choice whether I go to the beach, my choice whether I go to a restaurant this week. And why do they use this language? In a sense, because it becomes so doxic, by which I mean, maybe we'll go back to Andrew's comments earlier, commonsensical. It's a language that seems so natural that freedom goes with having the choice to do things that we rarely ask much about it. And we continue to think of it as something that constitutes freedom, even if we don't usually craft the menu of options, even if we don't make the rules, even if not everybody gets to play the same game. It's still the kind of baseline understanding. And I should say that when I talk about choice here, I don't mean just any kind of thought. I mean very specifically this mode of picking from a menu of options based on some kind of what are assumed to be sort of interior preferences, things we have imagined sort of at the boundaries between what's interior and our actions in the world. So now I promise I'll turn to something a little less present than I did. The book I'm writing has two primary agendas, or I would call them big agendas. And the first one is a properly historical one, so you won't be shocked or anything. And that's to say, how did this happen? How did we get to the point where choice has become something like a proxy for freedom across so many realms of life and across so much of the globe? Now, if you're a medievalist or early modernist, like lots of people I'm looking at right now, you know this is not how freedom has always been conceptualized. I don't think that's necessarily apparent to most people. That's not that freedom hasn't always felt this way. But if you're an early modernist, for instance, you note that to be free in Europe had very little to do, for most of history, with this idea that you could forge your own life path. In fact, being free might have been something quite different. It was generally a status category. And because you had a status as a free or independent person, it meant, in fact, that you had the kind of stability and security that meant you did not have to make choices at every turn about whom to marry, or how to earn a living, or where to live, or what to believe. Part of your freedom came from the fact that those were, in some sense, determined for you. And when you had a real choice, it took more the form of what was this very popular allegory of the 18th century, Hercules' choice, to do the right and just thing or to do the wrong thing, the unvirtuous thing. That's how choice was generally understood, not as this kind of loose menu of possibilities that were unmorally weighted choices. I prefer the Nike sneakers to the Reebok sneakers or something like that. So clearly something happened. And what I'm interested in is how our notion and even our feeling of what it meant to be free evolved over time to be so radically different. And before I tell you what my hypothesis is, I'll tell you sort of what my kind of working theoretical assumptions are, 3 of them that kind of guide this. And none of which I think are typical for historians who are interested in, Andrew mentioned, this popularity these days of writing histories of neoliberalism. I don't think any of these are sort of central to what most people do when they're thinking of this mode. The first one nobody will mind, which is that you need to go back a pretty long way and do a kind of long-range history that takes us, I think, as far back at least as the 17th century, and that doesn't prioritize, in fact, and this may be strange coming from somebody who's really a historian of revolutions, but does not prioritize the age of revolutions as a fundamental break, that does not imagine that the minute there was democratic revolution, choice was the obvious category in which people would operate. So it's a long story with roots that are pre-revolutionary, but which the strands don't really come together till well after the age of revolutions. The second of these principles is that the way people came to think about choice, which I would call an ideology, happened not because lots of people went out and say read Kant, though of course Kant is vital, but it happened not just in the sort of philosophical texts that are critical to the way many people write the history of freedom, but in the doing. And so that means exploring a lot of social practices that involve choice, things like picking a dancing partner, some of which will sound minor, but I think were really important, and a lot of technologies of choice, things like menus and ballot boxes. And part of this project will be to try to demonstrate how ideologies are made. And I think they're made through a combination of these social practices and the ways those social practices get talked about. So it's not that it's purely out of social practices, but behaviors and ways of talking together need to sort of coalesce for ideologies to form, for things to become so ordinary and that they seem almost natural. And finally, a history of freedom has to be a history of regulation, because it's a history of constraints in some ways makes freedom. And so rather than think of choice as just the opportunity to do whatever you want, quite the opposite. I'm interested in the formal laws and the informal social norms that created constraints and obstacles and made choice possible, that in a sense structured it, though that sounds rather paradoxical. And those structures were also, I think it's important to say, they have lots of particularities, but the one that I'm especially interested in is the way that they were gendered, which we'll come back to in a moment. So that finally takes us to how would this unfold as a story in some way, some kind of narrative. And my starting point really is the latter part of the 17th century, maybe even a little earlier. The first 2 chapters, I think you can't really understand this story without going back, one, to the age of empire and the rise of state-sponsored trading companies, especially in England and France, which create a kind of pluralism of goods that I'll talk about in a moment. And the other is the aftermath of the Reformation and the wars of religion, which I'm hoping all of you religion people will have something really interesting to say about, not least Jonathan here, which created a kind of pluralism of ideas as a problem to be dealt with. And in the first case, therefore, I think one of the first places where choice develops in importance is in what we would call today either aesthetic choice or consumer choice. Very specifically, I'm interested in how cottons imported from the East, calicos, for instance, come in all these marvelous patterns and colors in the early modern world, and they take Europe by storm. They're available at lots of price points, so it's not just for the wealthiest people. And picking them becomes a matter of picking something based on its appeal, insofar as the green one and the red one and the flowered one are going to cost the same amount in many cases. And so by the end of the 18th century, English has this wonderful neologism that we're pretty used to now called shopping. The word first crops up in the very last 2 decades of the 18th century. And I want to know how this practice of imagining, not just buying things at a market, say, but the idea that somebody curates a set of possibilities with variety as one of their key elements. There's lots of talk of offering choice goods for your choice. I mean, choice operates in these 2 ways in English language, in French, and in French it actually does similarly too. So I'm interested in the very first part. Starts out with auctioneers, shopkeepers, merchants who try to come up with a kind of rules for regulating this new enterprise where ordinary people at different price points and in different settings will be offered a chance to kind of perform this activity of picking in the public sphere. I'm also interested in the people who perform this, who are both men and women. And I'm interested in the legacy it leaves, which is that, interestingly, shopping, the very first kind of choice, I think, gets kind of tainted, though men and women both perform it, as specifically female, as often irrational, and as potentially kind of morally dangerous, particularly for those sort of moral choices that take the Hercules form. So that's one part of the story. That's the part that maybe seems most obvious, because that's where we still think of choice as having markets and things. But I want to sort of look at it from a variety of angles. But simultaneously, choice emerges in another realm that's much less remarked on, I think. And that is as a form that sometimes takes the linguistic form of religious choice, more often freedom of conscience. But this idea of a kind of individual conscience is also, I think, central to the emergence of notions of choice. Now, again, I won't go on right now, but of course there are many ways this doesn't resemble choice in the modern sense. But it does also, over time, I think, become secularized in various forms. Even in Milton, you get an idea of choice in books, has some direct connection to the idea of liberty of conscience. And I'm again interested in kind of lived experience. This time, if you cross the Atlantic in particular, the world of the First Great Awakening in North America, specifically Penn's experiment in my current home city of Philadelphia, in which people begin to kind of try out this possibility of choice in ideas, whether that's through dueling ministers, whether that's through competitive printers. I'm interested in the practice of commonplacing, for instance, where you get somebody like Benjamin Rush, who, attends different sermons in different kinds of churches on different days, and gets a commonplace book where he writes down the ideas he likes. In a sense, he selects well before Thomas Jefferson cuts up a Bible and takes out the parts he likes. You have somebody like Rush combining what might be thought of as religious and secular ideas, picking from a kind of menu of possibilities of what's available in both bookstores and in churches and in revivalist meetings. There, again, men and women both perform this activity. It gets, over time, this kind of choice, though, is generally gendered much more masculine and has a different kind of trajectory. Both of those are important to the story. The modern part I'll tell you in just a few sentences because it'll probably be of less interest, but I am interested in choice in social relations, particularly in marriage, where things get more complicated. Both of these stories funnel into a story of marriage where people have to sort of pick each other, partners. And in the 19th century, social dance takes up many of these kinds of courtship rituals, along with new rules that allow for, on top of aesthetic choice and intellectual choice or choice in belief, comes to be affective choice, which would be choice about one's emotional life and attachments, and sexual choice. And then finally, very late in the game, for those people who think the Age of Revolutions changed everything, comes individuated choice in politics, insofar as the secret ballot, the idea of an individuated choice where you have to protect the private preferences of the individual, really doesn't become a norm until the late 19th century. And there's an interesting story there, I think, about the relationship between the rise of the possibility of women having suffrage, and the creation of, again, this kind of individuated notion of choice, this time aggregated out of individual choice. And finally, in the 20th century, many of these parts come together when you have the beginnings of a science of choice. Sciences, I guess I should say, from economics and management to psychology, a kind of fascination leading up to rational choice theory of thinking of the human as fundamentally a chooser. And this too has lasting implications, I think, for modern politics, and particularly for feminism, which grows out of this long history. So that's the whole narrative. It sounds a little strange, perhaps, because as Andrew pointed out, I'm in some ways an unusual intellectual historian in that I'm not always interested in the big ideas that are explicitly fought about by the most advanced thinkers of their moment. I tend to be interested in ideas that are so ordinary we don't really notice them that much. But that said, my approach to this is strictly historical. So my first agenda, despite the sort of odd parts perhaps, should be thought of as a history of, perhaps you might call it an ideology out of social practices. And I should pause for 1 second. I don't have that much more to say, but I do want to tell you about my second agenda. Is there any, if I have said anything that hasn't made any sense yet, I don't quite know how to be signaled, but Michael, maybe you can tell me if anybody's stopped me mid-direction. Keep going? Okay, I'll tell you the last part now. The second agenda, some of you may find more problematic, and that is to ask, can a historian come to a set of kind of normative conclusions about a topic? Must a historian only describe sort of what's happened in the past that gets us to where we are, or can the historian, in a sense, weigh in? And as some of you know, there actually is a big literature on choice these days. It's just not by historians. It's by psychologists and economists, for instance, who tell us that, in fact, we don't choose all that well. We often choose very badly. We don't know our preferences, or these days with the kinds of choices we face, even sort of what could you watch in an evening on Zoom, the choices seem infinite. We're overtaxed by what's sometimes called kind of an overflow of choice. And simultaneously, we have political theorists and philosophers telling us often these days that our focus on choice is kind of a trap. We spend so much time trying to figure out what we want, we don't have any energy left over for trying to figure out what we want collectively. Or even worse, that choice is a kind of cover for other things. We don't see structural inequalities because we're so focused, for instance, on choice. So we think of poverty as a result of a series of bad choices, let's say, rather than as determined by other kinds of factors. All of this literature is really interesting. Historians have had almost nothing to say about it. And what I wonder is, can a historian whose specialization is not the present and whose methods are ones that are familiar to all of us, try to use history in some sense to comment and come back to the present, trying not just to estrange us, which is a typical technique of an intellectual historian, which is to say, just look how different things are in the past, it might make you think differently about the present, but actually to try to demonstrate through history the ways choice both has helped open up all kinds of possibilities over time and limits our ability to imagine new futures. So the point is not to write a presentist history in the sense that I'm trying to be scrupulous about recounting 17th and 18th century developments and reading sources ranging from, dance manuals to early advertisements in as careful a historical fashion as I can. But in the spirit of somebody like, for my aspiration would be something like the methods of someone like Rosenfeld or Hannah Arendt, a kind of political theorist who often incorporates historical thinking. Can a historian do the opposite? Which is, I want to say, not just provide background for other people, but what I might, and certainly not provide political points, but to try to think through the sort of moral questions, the larger philosophical questions that structure this kind of question, and that become apparent, I think, when you start trying to disentangle these different lines. So I hope that, it's taking me a long time to do this because actually it's rather a difficult task to try to figure out how to put these different things together to respond to psychologists, for instance, and economists along with historians. But I do think I would like to make a sort of plea for historians to not always try to certainly to think about the past as a different country, as we all do, but at the same time to think why history might be important as we try to imagine the sort of future of what look like increasingly actually illiberal democracies in many parts of the world. And so I really welcome your thoughts on this enterprise, your suggestions about how to do it or what to read, your skepticism about the plausibility of any of this or anything else. And I will be delighted to hear all thoughts and comments. Thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you, Sophie.
Silent clapping.
Exactly. Then I believe, yeah, that was wonderful. And I was actually, even in our correspondence before this, I was conveying to you just my experience of how, since in the anticipation for this lecture, thinking about it and anticipating it has just made me aware of just how omnipresent this quality, this equivalence of freedom with choice is in the modern era, and how that's not to be taken for granted. But before I get ahead of myself, I'll save up some of those reflections for the actual discussion. Jonathan, would you like to step in now and give us a few comments and a few reflections of your own?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Sophie, that was great. And these are necessarily kind of off the cuff reactions. And I think I would start by asking Sophie, maybe just inviting you to talk a little bit more about the way in which you're thinking about the forces driving the generation of this ideology. I mean, it sounded like we're saying that it's the experience of plenitude or the experience of variety and options that gives people, that sort of provides a sort of foundation for thinking about choice as a proxy for freedom, as you put it. There might be a way to flip the story, though. I wonder if there might be. I mean, I'm thinking one of the classic thought pieces for late 17th century challenges to the ability of the human will to do anything. Actually, it would be the famous choice that Burdon's ass has to make between the two equally delicious bales of oats, and whether he is able, the ass is able to choose between two equally, two perfectly symmetrical options, and exert him or herself, himself in the case of Burdon's ass, in order to make a free choice, which suggests that. So this becomes a thought piece, as you probably know, because people are wondering whether or not there's anything like true indifference out there, or whether or not, in fact, we're always constrained by sets of frameworks to making choices that feel like choices, but in fact aren't choices at all. That is, we are products of environment. We're products of the kind of causal chains that give rise to our circumstances today. And that might lead us to think that we're feeling free when we're making choices, but in point of fact, someone like Spinoza or any number of other people would say that we're not free at all. So there might be a way in which you could ask this question the other way, which is that as new kinds of constraint come into the world, new senses of the person, let's say, not as a product of a self-standing bundle of faculties with will and reason and a soul that would be orienting itself in the world, but a person now is a natural, at best a natural being, perhaps a social being, given a kind of place in the world by forces larger than yourself. That choice would seem to be more rather than less plausible position for the individual. So I was just curious how that other side of the story, how you think about that, because I think one of the things that has always attended, and the rise of behavioral economics seems like the perfect response to rational choice. I mean, it's, you know, you think you're choosing, but you're not choosing. In fact, the world is choosing for you. Your brain is choosing for you, whatever you think it might be. That kind of tension between the possibility of choosing as freedom and the possibility of choosing as merely the illusion of freedom seems to me something which is baked into your ideology from the beginning. So that might be another way of asking whether there are kind of critiques of choice or alternatives to choice. Obviously, there are lots of them. You can think of, the whole discourse on autonomy in the 18th century is not about choice so much as it is about what Kant would call kind of rational evaluation of one's self-worth. So there are these alternatives out there, and I just wonder how it is, in your view, that choice manages to elbow them all out of the way, and whether it ever really manages to shed the sense that what you're choosing, when you're choosing, you're not actually choosing. You're always selecting between options that the world is presenting to you. And some things that I've read of yours, Sophie, suggest that this is going to be important to your story later on when you talk about voting, for example. So I think that might just be just a first order reflection on this, and maybe we could use that to just encourage you to talk a little bit more about the historical arc of your story. I would note, by the way, that heresy comes from the word choose. And so you might make something of living in the age of the Homo hereticus, since if we are in fact living in an age of choice, then we're living in an age of and in that sense, it really was not choosing between indifferent options, which is what much of your understanding of choice sort of seems to be, that the world doesn't present you with an option which is necessarily better than the other ones. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be a choice. Heresy suggests that you can choose if you want, but the choosing is always going to be a matter of significant, it's going to represent something like a fall from the proper kinds of choices that one might make. So that's just an opening provocation more than it is a measured reflection. One last little comment. Something that you wrote made me go back and look at Hobbes, and Hobbes saying that and I'm not, as you can see, I'm more of the intellectual historian who spends time on Hobbes than on other things. But Hobbes famously says, right, that the will is the last appetite of deliberation. That it's the last aversion or desire that you have for a particular action to be performed or not performed. So for him, choice is exactly the moment when liberty, that is the liberty to doing or not doing, is gone, and the thing is over. That is, the deal is effectively done. So that might be another counter theory of what a choice actually looks like in the early modern period. So I wonder how your version of choice wins out over these other versions of choice that might be out there. Okay, I'll stop there. I think I probably shouldn't talk for longer than that.
Those are some pretty terrific reflections for off the cuff, I have to say. Thank you very much. Tell me, others, should I respond to that, or should we let other people get a word in edgewise?
I would actually say, Sophie, if you would like to respond to that, then please do so, and then after that we can begin the discussion. We can open up the discussion.
And I'll respond really very briefly to say that Jonathan sort of asked the $64,000 question, as it's called, which is the perfect question, which is first of all, how does choice, in a sense, win out, the modern notion of choice, over these other possibilities? But also, shouldn't we acknowledge that many of the limitations that contemporary social scientists find in choice are there from the beginning? And the answer to the latter is certainly yes, that both external constraints and internal constraints are identified and problematized from the beginning. Choice is very problematic for a very long time, whether it's notions of conscience or notions of consumer picking, which are quite different from one another. It's always a problematic idea. And it's problematic. I focused a little bit in this, and will in the book as well, on the gender aspects of it, but there are many different aspects of the problem of choice that one could focus on. And I think a proper history of choice has to acknowledge the ways in which it always puts in contention freedom and the illusion of freedom, as you so aptly put it, pluralism and constraint. And what's distinctive about the modern period is, one, the falling away in some ways of the moral valences around so much of choice, and the other is the way in which some of the problematization of choice also starts to disappear. But it happens very late. And so when people are sometimes talking about what we call neoliberalism, it's not my favorite term, but let's just use it for a second. They often act as if this just happened in 1970 or something like that. I think what happened more is that some of the complexity around choice fell away, but it happened very late. And one of the major contributions of the kind of religious thought that you're referring to, these sort of 17th century moralists and things, is that they're very aware that choice is a complicated problem. You don't want to coerce somebody into what they believe, and yet there are right things to believe and wrong things to believe. And it's a complex problem, and some people are righter than others. So all of this is really vital to the story.
Thank you, Sophie. I am not that familiar with the modalities of Zoom. So Michael, can I defer to your greater expertise in this? And do we have questions already coming in?
We do not. If anybody has a question they would like to ask, please take a spot in the queue right now, messaging, and we will call on people as they go. I see right now we're going to start off with Matthew Champion. Please feel free to unmute yourself and let me know if you can.
Hello, and thank you. Wonderful paper. Full of things for me to think about. So I have one question, which is the kind of medieval historians question, which is it's very common for modern historians and intellectual historians to kind of dive back to the 17th century, and I was interested in the example of commonplace books there. Partly because in my area, which is largely 15th century materials, in those kind of laicized monastic communities of the Devotio Moderna, you see the emergence of the Riparia books, which are basically a form of commonplacing. And it got me to thinking, while you were talking about kind of the role of printing and choice here, even about the function of books of hours as kinds of trainers of choice and individualization of commodities, where you essentially choose from a repertoire, but you choose personally, and that choice is, of course, configured by certain other kinds of identities you've chosen, be they within particular religious orders, be they particular devotions to particular saints, be they kind of aesthetic preferences for styles or affective preferences. And so I suppose I wanted to sort of, I don't know, juxtapose the impulse to kind of see a genealogy and as a historian of temporality myself, ask you to be maybe a little bit less chronological and a little more asynchronic in the way you approach these questions. And I suppose then to lead into the second part of the question, which is when you turn to the second part of your project on kind of, can a historian weigh in? How does a historian weigh in? Well, one of the things which historians can do to weigh in is precisely not to make this a story of genealogies, but to make it a story of asynchronies. I mean, you run the risk of sort of falling into a modern choice mentality there. That is that you pick and choose what you like, and you offer a kind of platter of choices to your reader there. I wondered though whether there seemed to be a reticence to go for a kind of actually, a political position here on choice. And to say, here's what I actually think about choice, and that's what motivates me writing this history. And I wondered whether there might be some other models in modern intellectual historians that offer you a way to really be very political about the way you write this. And I'm thinking here of Tim Rogan's fantastic book, Moral Economists, where it seems to me he is offering a thoroughly political intervention, saying the route we need to take out of the bind we're in is Karl Polanyi's. Now, you might disagree with that clear sense that there's a political agenda in your history, but I found that incredibly refreshing as a way of framing the way that a modern intellectual historian can say, I am a politician, I do politics, here's how I intervene, and sort of actually do it very explicitly. So they're the sort of twin parts of my question.
That's a wonderful question, because it's got so much going on. And yes, and you've touched on sort of a theoretical problem as well as a kind of topical question. So the topical one is about going back to the commonplacing. So I'm very interested in these practices that, as you point out, commonplacing is hardly invented in the 17th or 18th century. It's an ancient practice. It takes on new forms and looks a little different at different moments. It's reinvented by Renaissance humanists. It's reinvented by Locke as a kind of practical practice. That said, it's important to pay attention. It's a little like social dancing. It exists everywhere, but it's practiced with different rules at different times. And one thing that interests me is the way that commonplacing sort of stops being as much about collecting, even from a limited repertoire, as you put it, collecting, which is to say taking the best of everything, and becomes, as the possible canon of things from which one can draw keeps expanding, becomes increasingly sort of heterodox and follows fewer prescriptive rules about what counts. So by the time I'm reading these, late 18th, early 19th century, I'm looking at a bunch from Philadelphia because I'm interested in Philadelphia in particular in this part. They put a recipe in next to a parable, next to a summary of a sermon or a bit of one they read somewhere, maybe cut out a magazine article. They look more like a scrapbook than they do with this collection of commonplaces. But that said, you're absolutely right that there's a danger here of a genealogy. And I'm trying to get away from genealogy by looking at moments, by finding kind of particular practices that emerge in specific moments so as to not tell a kind of story of everything coming together. It's very hard to avoid. What I haven't managed to do, which I would love to do, and you're inspiring me with this idea, is when I said that I like, Arendt is a wonderful model for somebody, I think, trying to do this. One of the things that Arendt does is not just give us a kind of plurispatial history but it's pluritemporal. In other words, you can talk about antiquity one minute and talk about the American Revolution in another. She's not constrained the way a historian is. I have had trouble freeing myself to that degree. I'd like to. I'm not sure I can, but I am hoping that by looking at these kind of micro practices, like commonplacing in a particular moment, or social dancing, or shopping for cottons, or there are other ones too, voting in a little booth with a curtain that you pull across yourself, I can kind of go to moments and places where I think something is revealed about the history of choice without creating a kind of grand narrative, though I know the way I told it makes it sound quite seamless. Finally, on the question of politics, thank you for the tip about what you read. I do shy away from the idea of making a political statement as such, because I don't really think histories should sort of take a stance on kind of the topic of the moment precisely. Though I have on occasion done that, but I've tried to sort of separate what might look like op-ed writing from historical writing to some degree. That said, I do think what historians can do is open up the conversation by saying, here's position A, here's position B. This is the debate we've been having. What if there's position C or D that's completely outside this kind of left-right framework or something like that? And that's where historians are useful. And it's particularly, I think, where historians who don't study the present are useful. This is back to medievalists, for instance. The world looks different, so you offer other possibilities. I am interested in choice in particular because I do think these critiques of choice are very important. And I'd like to kind of emphasize, as Jonathan said, the way there's a kind of long history of choice as problematic. At the same time, choice is also been very instrumental. Imagining that we have choices has been instrumental in allowing us to imagine that we can change the world in various ways. A world that doesn't imagine choice doesn't necessarily imagine alternative paths. And I think that you see this particularly kind of if you read fiction of the 19th century, you start seeing that all these women characters, Portrait of a Lady, for instance, the heroine says at one point, tell me what my choices are. And she's asked, why do you want to know? And she says, because I just want to know what I can't do. I want to know what I can do, but I want to know what I can't do. I'm not paraphrasing this very well, but there's a sense of like needing to know the possibilities at all moments. So I'm trying to account for what it would look like to make choice not always our central political category, but still imagine it as having kind of moral foundations and a realm, opening up a realm of possibility without taking a kind of, for or against position. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to it, but it was such a rich question. There was a lot to respond to.
Thank you, thank you.
Sophie, just for your reference, that was Matthew Champion, who's one of my colleagues in the MEMS program at ACU. Can I just ask other people who are asking questions, when you unmute your microphone and begin to ask, preface that just quickly by introducing yourself. That would be just great for all of us in getting to know each other. Thank you.
The next person on our list is Shannon Gilmore.
Hi, Sophia. Thank you so much for your talk. It was very thought-provoking. Oh, sorry. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm just making sure. I'm Shannon Gilmore. I'm also with ACU, and I was really interested in this notion of gender that you brought up at the beginning of your talk, especially when you're talking about shopping and the ways in which this choice making that women were having at this time was kind of cast in this negative light, maybe in a way to sort of belittle or temper their freedom of choice. And I was wondering if they were, in other aspects of society, if there are other moments in which they were making choices, and whether we also see this trend of sort of trying to limit their freedoms in a way while also giving it to them. So sort of trying to hold them back, but also giving them that little bit of freedom to make those choices.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because shopping as it emerges, which is different from sort of provisioning, which is a very traditional female role for sure. Shopping is a somewhat in-between activity. One generally shops for things that are related to either one's own body or household. So in that sense, it's a traditionally feminine activity, but it also takes place in the public world, in a space that's exterior, and it turns into a kind of leisure time activity, especially for sort of middling sorts or bourgeois types, people, there are lots of accounts of going to Paris or going to London and being amazed by the shops and the shop windows, and this new emphasis on display that sort of pulls women into the interior of shops, so they're not out in the street, but they're also not at home. And it's a kind of problematic space in some ways, and it's a sort of problematic activity too. And my sense is that it, in a way, taints consumer choice early on, because it's often described as a feminine activity, though men do it as well. It allows choice to appropriate lots of traditional feminine qualities. Whim and fancy, for instance, inconstancy. Many of these things, in fact, evoke, back to Jonathan's point, the kinds of things that behavioral economists will tell us in the late 20th century are the problems with the way we choose. That, we don't know our own mind, we're too easily persuaded by other people, we're seduced by different frameworks or different kinds of display. And yet that's precisely how shopping is described. So on the one hand, it seems like a new kind of freedom, but on the other hand, it's a problematic kind of freedom, probably because it's a new space, a new kind of activity. And I think the implications are important, not just for women, but for choice over the long run. many of these activities, the choice activities, all hover in a space, in a sense that are kind of semi-public, semi-private. You go out to hear a sermon, let's say, but you write about it in your commonplace book. You go to a dance, but it has to do with courting. And even when women start to vote, part of it has to do with the fact that voting itself has been tamed. It's become a very orchestrated, choreographed, you might say, activity that happens in a public space, but in a private space within a public space. So I'm interested in the way these are opportunities for women, but they're not quite the same as sort of independent thought. They're picking from sets of options that women don't usually determine on their own, and they're done in this sort of in-between way. And they're, to this day, I think if you look at the discussions around being pro-choice, for instance, you'll see some of the problems why that language is actually not ideal for describing what might better be described as something like reproductive justice or equity, or in a variety of other terms.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next person on our list is Michael Warby.
Hi, I'm a fringe dweller. I'm a what you might call free enterprise medievalist, because I part own a business that puts on medieval and ancient days for schools. I have to say business is very slow at the moment. Anyway, so I was, first question was, were you aware of the work of, I don't know if this shows up well, Christina Bichari? I'm probably butchering her name. She's a philosopher who works on norms, and particularly how norms arise and how they are abandoned. And this is collective choice, and she's worked out a very thorough analysis. It's very clear. Her two books are The Grammar of Society and Norms in the Wild, which is the one I'm showing up here. What's particularly fascinating about her is her work is actually both rigorously theoretical and extremely practical. She is a consultant for people like UNICEF on how you change norms. So if you're looking at choice and norms over time, her work is enormously useful and very, very clear. So she's got some online lectures, but her books are, well, Grammar of Society, I have to say, it's a formal work, so it's dense. But Norms in the Wild is designed to be much more practical and is informed by her practical experience. So I would really strongly recommend that.
Thank you.
Another on the sort of choice question in the modern world, there's a economist called Carvalho, who C-A-R-V-A-L-H-O, can't remember his first name. He wrote a study called The New Veiling Movement. And it is about how veiling took up in the modern Islamic world when it was in retreat, and it was taken up by middle-class Muslim women to start with. Because what women were doing is Muslim women were doing, is they were going away from their neighborhood where they were chaperoned. And there's a whole thing in Islam of why that was so desperately important. And they were going out and choosing to be educated, work in the world, work in places away from their neighborhood. And in order to, in a sense, protect this choice, they adopted the whole headgear as a protective mechanism. So on one hand, it's an expression of expanded choice, but on the other hand, they're adopting this religious signaling as a protection. I'm a good Muslim woman, so therefore I'm allowed to do this. And that's, of course, you see it all around us, but that's a vastly different notion of and context for choice than what Western women went over in the same time. So I just offer those as two contrasts.
Thank you very much for those comments. So Christina Bichari is actually, I don't know her very well, but she teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, as I do, and she's really interested in something fascinating, which is the practical problem of how do you get people to change norms. I know she's done work, for instance, helping. There's an interest in putting more toilets into India, for instance, but it's not a matter of simply installing them. It's getting people to take that to be a norm as using them. And there is a lot of interesting practical work of that sort being done about how do you get people to change social norms, behaviors. You know, some of this work started around things like social practices in the era of AIDS, social practices in sanitation around the world. It's really interesting stuff. Law professors too sometimes work on this from a different angle, which is trying to understand when social norms are more effective than formal laws, when you can get people to do things without regulating it or creating formal statutes, but to make something so sort of socially ordinary that there isn't a need anymore to kind of enforce laws. And I think this work is all fascinating. It's very little looked at by historians, so I'm glad you brought it up, because you know, one of the things that I think we are all interested in some ways, is how does this happen in the past? We know that over time people do things differently, but we don't always know why their practices change, and including the most mundane kinds of practices, table manners, for instance, ordinary things that people do, you know, which meals a day they eat, how do they sit at the table, this kind of thing. And these are the kinds of things that probably weren't imposed by a kind of, you know, UN consultant, but some level of social pressure was directed towards very intimate kinds of ordinary behaviors. So I think it's an important thing to study. And again, you bring up the fact that I am mainly talking about a Western European and its colonial outposts development. In the case of voting, for instance, Australia is a central part of the story, and for obvious reasons, for the secret ballot. That said, one of the things that interests me, which I won't have that much to say about, but I hope others will, is that some of these practices have now become global norms. It doesn't mean they've been incorporated the same way. So for instance, consumer choices become extremely important in places like Korea with very different cultural traditions. It doesn't mean that they're therefore approached the same way that they are if I go shopping in New York City. But one interesting thing is what happens when these kind of essentially Western notions of choice, of different forms of markets, intersect with other ways of conceptualizing social behavior, freedom, responsibility to others, these sorts of questions. So they're anthropological questions, but I think they're also historians' questions.
Thank you. Our next person in the question queue is Jonathan Sheehan.
So I'm back. Sophie, I just wondered if there was a reflexive side of this project. I mean, I was sitting here thinking about historians and history writing, and it got me thinking about War and Peace, actually, and the sense in which history is a space for you know, the operations of forces beyond particular choices, and then historians like to spend a great deal of time thinking about how they're really interested in writing the contingency, how things might be otherwise, into their you know, as almost a kind of political project to, you know, to show that the choices that people made in the past were not the choices that they had to make. They might have made other choices, and if we were able to imagine those other choices, we might get to position C or D in your, as you put it, as a kind of ethical part of the historian's trade. So I'm wondering, for yourself, do you think of yourself as trading in some of this kind of hope for the possibility of contingency, of freedom, of selecting different options for you know, human flourishing as part of what it means to be a person, as a historian yourself, of the, you know, even as a critical historian of this, or is this something that, I mean, because another version of the story, as you could say, it's just all the one damn thing after another, you know, that we're just floating along, so there might possibly be in some counterfactual world a position C, but we don't live in that world. In which case the ethical position of the historian would be bleaker.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I've never really liked, though it's probably quite accurate, how the idea that lots of things happen in history by accident. And of course they probably do, but it's a very unsatisfactory sort of idea that, you know, it's just a matter of contingency. If there hadn't been a terrible storm at that moment, or if somebody had gotten the news to somebody faster, this wouldn't have happened. That sort of, I don't think we like that approach to things, because we want to feel there are deep reasons why things happen. But that's a very interesting framing you just gave. I have to think about it a little bit more. Somebody, gave an interesting critique of the project not long ago when I was presenting a different part of it, and said, but you're not saying enough about how individual people came to their own choices about things. And that's true. I mean, I do, in some sense, neglect. There are individuals who play a role in the story, but I'm not so interested in their kind of personal motivations. On the other hand, I suppose my own motivations are all over this, is kind of what you're saying, that I have my own, and I am attached to the idea that choice matters, even as I see its problems. I mean, maybe in some ways that's a very loose kind of moral defense of a certain kind of liberal position, without it being, not liberalism in the sort of political terms of today, but a kind of liberalism that imagines the importance of possibility, but also sees all the ways in which choice is a very cramped and limited conception of things, and can the historian show otherwise? But I have to think about your comment. It's interesting enough that I don't think I have a glib answer for it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Our next question is from Nathaniel Cutter.
Hi there. I'm a PhD candidate at Melbourne Uni. I look at British expats in North Africa in the 17th century. I'm interested in, and thank you for your talk. It's such broad implications. It's really important to think through all of this, both for us early modernists and for everyone else. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about your thinking around the religious marketplace, this sense that you can change and choose. I'm particularly interested in religious conversion from Christianity to Islam and back again. The captivity narratives in the 17th century provide this really interesting self-presentation from people sometimes who have been induced to convert to Islam or who have chosen to convert, and how they present their choice or lack thereof, sometimes around being forced to do it, sometimes around choosing to do it, but really being inside one way or the other, but at the same time seeking to faithfully represent the kindnesses and the opportunities that were shown to them during their time in captivity and after being freed. It's an interesting set of primary sources to think about this very transgressive choice that they're trying to justify, excuse, hide away, and to not quite promote, but at least engage with in the public square.
It's interesting that your choice of the term marketplace for this. So I'm curious. I don't want to turn the question totally back to you, but I wonder about when it makes sense or doesn't to talk about a religious marketplace. Now, we tend to we'd use the word marketplace very loosely these days, right? We talk about also a marketplace of ideas is common in American jurisprudence, but it's actually an expression from the 1920s. It's not an expression from, the First Amendment debates of the 18th century. This notion, I'm always hesitant to try to think of marketplace as the metaphor for each of these domains, because I actually think we make choices in quite different ways in different kinds of settings. And it's only very recently that, sort of public choice theorists, for instance, imagine elections as being like marketplaces. But I'm not sure that we think in every conversion, for instance, seems to me a very different thing than a choice, right? One doesn't convert because you sort of went, pros and cons, let me see. You convert because of some overwhelming compulsion to, I think, generally, that drives you. Now, it doesn't mean that there hasn't been a change. It doesn't mean that it doesn't create a kind of fluidity. But I'm not sure even my example of Benjamin Rush, maybe comes closest to this. He isn't exactly church shopping, as the expression goes, though he's interested in ideas from a lot of different places. He's not exclusively interested in one denomination. He doesn't convert all the time, but he does send his children at different moments to different kinds of Christian schools. He never leaves, obviously, Protestantism, but within Protestantism, he tries out a lot of different things. But I think one problem sometimes with the history of so-called neoliberalism is the assumption that all we've done is turn everything into a marketplace as a kind of steamroller across all of human existence. I'm not even sure that describes the present, but I really don't think it describes the past. On the other hand, I'm really interested in, you know, this idea that people in a lot of earlier eras are interested in how people navigated the confrontation with opposing sets of beliefs and values. Did they try to assimilate them to each other? Did they hold disparate ideas together? There are a lot of possibilities, and I think it's a really great area of inquiry.
Thank you. Our next question is from Chris Ocker.
Hi, Sophie. Is this on?
Yeah.
Gosh, this is so rich. There's so much to there's so much to wonder about and to ask about. I'm struggling with myself here, and I think what I'll do is pick off of Nat's point. I just to say that I think there's far more diversity and pluralism in medieval society than people often imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the challenges is similar to the challenge you touched on earlier, and it's the question of normative sources, intellectual sources, and lived in everyday life. You know, you know, we know how groups polemicize against each other. We know that certain groups, we know that clergy generally have certain ambitions for what the texture of society should be. For example, by the 15th century, most of them seem to agree that Jews shouldn't be part of the Christian society, maybe not even as a subordinate part, you know, things like that. But does that mean that people actually really embrace that or not? Should we assume that the opposite is the case, that actually they have these anxieties because people actually are attracted to differences among each other? And then within Christianity itself, there's quite a lot of competition between clergy who have different kinds of churches. The differences may seem very subtle to us, like differences of liturgy, some differences of feast days. There are local regulations that try to, you know, moderate their connections to each other. And this is true, I believe, in cities all over Europe, you know, so like who can ring church bells at what time, and the size of churches, there are controversies about all those things. So I wonder if maybe, you know, the thing that changes is not so much the development of a greater plurality, but shifts in that plurality, or if what really changes are the narratives that people have available to themselves, or the paradigms, if you will, that they have available to themselves to interpret these things. So thinking of Nat's example of conversion, so a lot of these conversion narratives that begin circulating in the 15th century, they have a pretty clear narrative structure, and they do all the things that Nat said. I mean, they seem to be, on the one hand, curious and appreciative of the Turkish society in which they were previously enslaved, but the whole point of the narrative is to say how they basically escaped that enslavement and returned to the true Christian faith. And so they don't, you know, that's the narrative form, and it seems to be subverted a little bit by the fascination and curiosity that's there. So I wonder if one could think that your argument rests on really relies on the notion on the existence of a consumer society, a society whose norms are really governed by consumption, and maybe especially one like, you know, the United States, that seems to fetishize personal choice over against collective action. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
That's, yeah. Now I just want to ask you what to read on to get to this. But I think you put your finger on something really important for all of this, which is the paradigms available alone can't really change how people see themselves. The practices alone, the kind of, and I'm very interested to hear your description of the medieval churches also offering a kind of pluralism, and I'd like to know more about that, because sometimes these are subtle. Even in the First Great Awakening, the question is really about whether you can replace one minister with another. I mean, it's sort of like choice, and you get a choice in minister. They're very specific kinds of questions. But I think in some sense, the answer is both, that it's both a way of making sense of the experience and the experience that would be described as choice. So the very beginning of this, to come to your question about consumer society, I'm interested in this auctioneer named Mr. Koch, who's very prominent in 1720s in London. And he's an obscure figure, but he had a lot of auctions of a lot of stuff. And he kind of invents a high-end auction. He figures out how to display all the goods, how to come up with these fancy catalogs showing what all the options are. But then he gives it a language too. He gives it a language of choice. He describes having choice objects and a choice of objects at different moments. And I don't think it's one thing or the other, but it's the creation of certain kinds of experience and a description of that experience that can then be kind of extrapolated from. So one question would be sort of, where is there religious pluralism? Where does it emerge? Is there religious pluralism already in the Catholic Church well prior to the Reformation, for instance? And the other would be, are there ways of talking about, thinking about, dealing with what happens when confronted with two different models or two different, are there ways of navigating this? Are there ways of talking about this? When those things happen together, I think, you start having what I would kind of call a discourse of choice. It's not yet even an ideology. It's only, I think, an ideology when it's so obvious and so internalized that in some ways we perform these activities and we think in these modes without giving it much reflection because they seem natural. But that doesn't happen overnight either. And then I'm also interested in how ideologies come apart, which they do, which is how you get changes in social norms, where certain assumptions are no longer kind of governing assumptions. And usually you need some kind of real crisis, and you're not really aware they even were governing assumptions until something happens that tears at that kind of commonplace. So I'm really, that's a fascinating comment, and if you'd be so kind, tell me what to read so I know more about how to think about this as a problem that's might be found in just a different form in the medieval world.
I like that. You know, what you just said about convergence makes a lot of sense to me. The convergence of something to form something like a discourse, because one of the struggles I have just thinking about this in a late medieval context. There are very few people who actually argue for sovereign choice, and those arguments are very famous. That Occam does, for example, but he's actually quite unsuccessful. He doesn't really convince that many people. Most people are qualifying his arguments to say that there's some kind of essentially divine agential act that has to precede an act of choice. So most of the discussion is really about how people have a will that allows them to be free to make choices that are, more or less conform to official teaching or something like that. So you're free to choose to essentially submit to to a predominant opinion. And so, how does that actually make sense? Well, obviously, it can't really. I don't think it can really reflect it.
Right. To us, that wouldn't seem like real choice. If your choice is to submit to the correct authority, and in some sense doesn't seem like what we mean by choice. But I do think that all ideas don't resonate in all moments. I mean, people can write books with startling ideas and they can be ignored for centuries. And some books really do resonate, for instance, or ideas or even words. And one of the limitations I think I've come to think about certain kinds of conceptual history in particular is the assumption that ideas change only sort of inside texts, that you don't need them to be able to resonate in the world in some way. Now, I don't think that's an argument for saying language doesn't matter. I would be the last person to say that. I think it's an argument for some kind of two-way street between the ways we talk about things and the ways we practice things, so that words can give expression to things that we're doing that then will change meaning because they've been given a word in some way. But most conceptual history sort of stays inside text to a considerable degree, whether we're talking about sovereign choice or anything else. And so it's interesting also to look at places where I think ideas didn't resonate necessarily, as you just suggested, ideas that are really minority currents and stay that way, probably because they don't do some kind of work in the world that's really useful in any broad way. I mean, sometimes they're just suppressed. That's another possibility. But I can, you know, there are texts that, or ideas that don't have currency at different moments. So that's as interesting in some ways. Or they're ideas that exist in a moment that are sort of outside of the dominant discourse. Those are interesting too. If we're even thinking about the present, you can think about the few areas in life in which we don't think choice explains much. We've gone to sort of biological determinism or something else as an alternative explanation. It's interesting why those areas are, in a sense, cordoned off from what might otherwise be a dominant discourse. So, yes, I do want to get, I mean, this comes back to Matthew Champion's earlier point about sort of being careful about not imagining sort of sweeping genealogies where everything gets swept up at once. There are always discordant ideas, breakout ideas, things that aren't resonating, alternative possibilities, and yet they don't necessarily dislodge the dominant story until some point when they do.
I'm mindful of the fact that we're getting on, and particularly because, of course, so this is the kind of now moving on to late evening for you. Would you have time perhaps for one more question, and then we'll call it a day?
I'd be happy to. I just don't want to try everybody else's patience. I hope nobody's sort of dying of, you know.
There's no real risk of that, I assure you. Michael, how are we looking? Do we have someone who would like to keep to formulate a relatively brief and concise and pointed question as a way to round off the evening?
We absolutely do. Miles Pattenden.
Hello, Sophia. Thank you very much for a very interesting and stimulating talk. I also work here at ACU, and I once wrote a book about the history of one particular choice, choosing from the 15th to the 18th century.
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
I once wrote a book about the history of one particular choice, that is choosing the Pope.
Okay. Sorry, I missed the key word.
From the 15th to the 18th century. So it was very interesting for me to hear your take on this develops. But partly because of that, and also I think building on what Chris Ocker has just said, I suppose my final question is really to ask you to say more about why you think that this is really one history of choice, or perhaps it isn't one history of choice, but if it isn't, if there's choice in multiple spheres and you're really writing multiple histories, how is it that as a historian you think that you can link them together and stop it being dominated in a way by the history of consumer choice, which is the easy one to fall on because it's the most visible, especially in that key 17th, 18th century period that we all enjoy for one reason or another. So it's a kind of broad question to get you to think about or respond to for the end.
So it's a nice, tough question for the end. Excellent. Yes, that's an excellent question because, of course, you're right. There's a danger here of either trying to write the history of everything, which is like the history of modernity or something like that, or the history of a lot of disparate things that don't really belong together. And choice in Pope, for instance, is a fascinating question. But there again, there were voting methods always, right, for how you determined a Pope. And there were very particular things. I don't really remember how, but the different ways of signaling your support for different people. What I'm hoping is not to say that everything leads inexorably in one direction and to sort of put together all these impossibly disparate things, but to suggest that there are emergent technologies of choice and behaviors of choice and rituals around choice that we can sort of recover and think about in relation to sort of contemporary claims about freedom and choice. So the freedom part is really where I think the larger story lies, which is to say that we've assimilated these things to all be elements of modern freedom. Human rights actually, human rights discourse makes the oddest number of choices into human rights principles. The Nepalese constitution, for instance, says, you know, choice of which seeds you plant is a human right. Some places it's choice of, you know, profession, choice of where you live, choice of, all of those things are to us very different. They have very different histories, but they've been, in a sense, rhetorically assimilated to one another in not just, and my point is not just in consumer culture, it's in democratic culture too, which is the human rights part. That said, you're absolutely right that the important thing is not to iron out all these differences. It's to imagine how these very disparate pieces, in some sense, fed into this very peculiar modern synthesis. We see the consumer part the most obviously, but I want to say that these other stories about marriage and voting, and even about the idea of religious choice as it's first formulated, have something to tell us about this modern story. In other words, let go of the idea that sort of markets just took over and ran through everything, but without dismissing that there is an important market piece in the early modern world. I don't know if that really satisfies what you've just asked, but it's probably the best that I can do at the moment. And I really do think that's a vital question.
Thank you very much.
Great. Then thank you so much, Sophie, because I think this talk has really exemplified so many qualities of your scholarship. And as I said, I mean, I think you pointed out also at one stage your partiality for ideas that we just simply are so self-evident and that we take for granted, and it's almost like kind of like the old furniture that clutters our minds, and we need something like your interventions to make us aware of them and make us realize, you know, how contingent their emergence actually is. So we're really looking forward to reading the book. No pressure, but please don't leave us waiting too long.
Be patient. Well, I mean, I can't begin to thank you all enough for your own patience this evening, and also for what were really terrific, starting with Jonathan's, you know, very thought-provoking questions and onwards to everyone else's. Those were unusually interesting and difficult questions, most of which I'm still wrestling with, and some of which I've jotted down to give better thought to in, you know, days to come. So let me really conclude mainly with a thank you to all of you. Andrew, thank you so much as well for what was for me a stimulating conversation. I hope not too boring for everyone else.
Great, thank you. Normally under other circumstances, we could all go for a drink right now.
Right.
That day will come again, hopefully, in the not too distant future. But yeah, thank you also to Jonathan. And let me also just emphasize to all our participants that just how much we appreciate it, because